Slavery was an advancement in the progress of man. This may seem absurd, but if one understands the reasons for its development and the even more barbaric practices it replaced, it is easy to realize why this statement holds true. One way that the development of mankind can be classified is into three periods: primitive man, civilized man, and modern man. Slavery was a tradition of civilized man. But before the age of civilized man came the age of primitive man. Humans, as in Homo sapiens, existed in the primitive stage for around 90% of our existence. This stage was characterized by a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, with small bands of people consisting of around 50 to 100 members. As this was before the adoption of agriculture, most of these primitive societies led nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles that led them to traverse wide stretches of land, perhaps even up to 15 kilometers of walking per day. Following herds or seasonal hunting grounds, these small bands would have had very little ability to store extra food beyond a few days, and certainly would not be able to carry a large surplus. This led to a natural limitation on the size of the bands. As populations grew and the wide dispersal of tribes slowly started to shrink, different nomadic tribes occasionally came into contact with one another, often when following the same herd or when happening upon one another while foraging prime habitats. These confrontations between primitive man were often characterized by tactics such as the ambush or the dawn raid. Casualty rates were extremely high, and some experts believe that in some places your chances of dying by another human being was as high as 40%. There was every incentive to eliminate the majority or even every single member of the other tribe. Genocide was the norm. Adult males of a competing band were slaughtered with little regard. Only women and children were occasionally taken prisoner by the winning side. Life was cheap in these times. Young children could be raised in the new tribe and easily assimilated. Women, who were much more valuable than men in any tribe due to their ability to give birth to new generations, could be taken and given as prizes to the men to ensure the continuation of the tribe at healthy population levels. What was not done after the genocidal slaughter of a tribe was to take slaves. This is for numerous reasons, many which were previously mentioned. First and foremost, as hunter-gatherer societies were nomadic, restrictions on the movement of an individual, as is usually the case with slaves via shackles or the restriction of movement outside a given property, would have been impossible. Given the opportunity, any slave taken could just attempt to run away and live off the land and seek freedom. Secondly, as surpluses were non-existent, there was not enough food to justify extra mouths to feed. Thirdly, every rival tribe member left alive posed a future threat to one's tribe. Thus, killing all competition was the best way to ensure the future survival of one's kin. In the life of primitive man, there was very little room for mercy. Death was around every corner, and the concept of slavery was an unheard of possibility. Losing a battle meant losing your life. Capture meant a sure, painful death. There was no possible road to redemption. The noble savage is a myth. At around 10,000 BC, humans began transitioning from nomadic hunter-gathering lifestyles to settled communities in certain parts of the world, specifically along the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. This was the beginning of our second period of mankind, civilized man. Civilized man coincides with the first agricultural revolution, sometimes referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, and besides the wide-scale use of farming, it was characterized by the domestication of animals, irrigation, and rapid population growth, among others. Having created fixed settlements while cultivating the land, human beings began domesticating plants such as barley and creating resilient strains that led to an increase in crop yields and an eventual surplus of food. Working the land and harvesting crops for large population centers is a very labor-intensive task, and this labor shortage was an impetus for the institution of slavery throughout the civilized world. Furthermore, by acquiring slaves, the free peoples or citizens of the city could live a more relaxed lifestyle, reaping the benefits through the work of others. Ancient Rome is a quintessential example of this, as it is estimated that up to 40% of its population was made up of slaves. So how were the slaves acquired? Well, through warfare and conquest, of course. The societies living in the period of civilized man had no qualms over conquering their neighbors and looting their possessions. The difference was what they decided to do with their vanquished enemies. Primitive man mostly slaughtered everyone, but civilized man more often than not took the vanquished peoples as slaves. This was viewed as a moral step up from their primitive ancestors. As we follow evidence through history, we see that slavery was a huge advantage for any new empire to become a success and thrive. Evidence has shown us that this was a way of life for nearly every civilization in existence. It simply was not a controversial institution. Slaves were needed for labor, whether it be for harvesting crops, building walls, or serving in the homes of the aristocracy of the given civilization. Slaves were therefore very important to the prosperity of civilized peoples. Slaves were not always foreigners, but could also come from the native population through the inability to pay debts, from the poor who sold themselves voluntarily, or from parents who sold their children for either a hefty sum or in some cases to even improve their lives. Slavery around the world took on many forms, and depending on a wide array of variables, a slave may be treated quite harshly or treated with relative kindness and accepted as part of the family. One aspect of slavery that was present in almost every civilized kingdom was the belief that it could be possible for a slave to achieve eventual freedom through a payment of money or good deeds. It was also widely expected that the children of a slave could also be free. This is where American slavery took its racist departure and bound even the offspring of slaves into perpetual servitude. Manumission, or the act of an owner freeing their slaves, was often seen as a benevolent gesture and even became quite the fad in Rome during the reign of Augustus, so much in fact that Augustus had to make a law that no Roman slave could be freed before the age of 30. Examples of leaders in history that went from slavery to emperor include Sargon of Akkad, Diocletian, and Justin I of the Byzantine Empire, among others. This is to say that slavery in the era of civilized man was at worst a step up from the certain death during capture in the age of primitive man, and at best perhaps obtaining the highest position in an empire. The civilizing of man steadily decreased the likelihood of being killed by another man. The age of modern man began roughly in the 17th to 18th centuries, with two key events in the West: the Enlightenment and the development of capitalism and industry. With the advent of labor markets and industrial capitalism, specifically in Great Britain, it is no wonder that this is where we first see the abolition of slavery. The drudgery of manual labor soon became replaced through mechanization, which created profits that could be distributed as wages to the workers. Coerced labor was no longer necessary nor advantageous, as it left the worker with no wages to contribute to the product market. As the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe, slavery began to completely disappear. The second contributing factor to the modernization of man was the Enlightenment. The scientific method was first developed by Christians because they believed in a rational God who created the universe according to rational laws that could be discerned by people made in his image. This led to an explosion of thought and scientific discovery that eventually made capitalism and the Industrial Revolution possible. Immanuel Kant's idea that rational human beings should be treated as an end in themselves and not as a means mapped onto the Christian concept of the Golden Rule. This served as a useful foundation for a future society, where intense cooperation and trust via capitalism would be key to rid society of scarcity, the bane of humanity. Where slavery did still exist, there became a constant drumbeat of pressure from abolitionists that began to see the immorality of the institution. It is important to note that this transition from coerced labor never happened completely in the socialist world. The Soviet Union, China, Nazi Germany, Cambodia, and North Korea all used or still do use coerced labor to fill the gap left in the labor market. Now, of course, the term slavery has not been used in these regimes. Rather, the slaves became prisoners, sent to work camps or gulags. Even today in modern North Korea, citizens are coerced into constructing large building projects like dams or for agricultural harvesting for the good of the nation without pay. Slavery has become an unthinkable and detestable practice in most of the world today, and rightfully so, as we live in the age of modern man with modern sensibilities. However, I see it as beneficial for humanity to understand the various stages we have gone through, and if not to vindicate our ancestors, we can at least be more sympathetic.